A stranger married her for protection, but his enemies knew exactly who she was. She had no name left that felt like hers anymore. No family, no home, no one waiting at the end of any road. Just a worn leather bag, a child with her mother's tired eyes, and a train ticket to a town she had never seen, carrying the last hope she had left in this world. And if you have ever felt like you were running from something you could not even name, like the ground kept shifting beneath you no matter how still you tried to stand, then you already know exactly how Clara Weston felt on that October morning, when the dust of Millhaven, Texas, rose up to meet her like a warning. Stay with me, because this story is going to go somewhere that will stay with you for a long time. If you love slow, emotional Western romance stories like this one, stories about broken people finding their way back to something real, then make sure you subscribe before this one ends. There are many more waiting for you. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Clara was 31 years old, and she looked like a woman who had spent the last 5 years holding something very heavy without ever being allowed to set it down. She was not fragile. She had never had the luxury of fragility. She had been a seamstress in St. Louis. A good one. Her hands were steady and her stitches were clean, and she had built a small, quiet life for herself and her daughter, Rosie, who was 6 years old and had brown curls and a habit of pressing her cheek against her mother's arm when she was frightened. Rosie was frightened a lot lately. It had started the night Clara's landlord, a man named Harlan Briggs, had come to collect more than rent. He was a wide man with small eyes and a mouth that never meant what it said. He had connections in the city. He had friends in law offices and courtrooms. And he had taken one long look at Clara and decided that a woman alone with a child had no real power to refuse him anything. He was wrong about that. Clara had refused him, clearly, quietly, and then she had packed everything she owned into one bag while Rosie slept, and she had walked out before the sun came up. But Harlan Briggs was not the kind of man who accepted being told no. He filed papers. He called in favors. He told people she had stolen from him, which was a lie. But lies told by men with money have a way of growing legs and walking into places the truth never gets invited. Clara had 2 cousins left in the world, one in Ohio, who pretended not to receive her letters, one in Millhaven, Texas, a woman named Dottie, who wrote back and said, Come now, I have a room. I have a friend who might have work for you. So Clara came. She arrived at the Millhaven station on a Tuesday with 42 cents, a child on her hip, and a kind of quiet desperation that does not announce itself because it has already moved past the stage of making noise. Dottie was not at the station. Clara waited an hour. Then, too, she asked after her cousin at the post office and was told that Dottie Marsh had taken ill 3 weeks ago and had gone to stay with her husband's family in Abilene. Dottie had not known Clara was already on the train when she left. So there Clara stood in a town she did not know, with a child pulling on her sleeve and asking if they were home yet. And Clara looked down at Rosie's tired face and said, Yes, sweetheart, we're going to find home right now. She meant it the way people mean things when they have no other choice but to mean them. She found the only boarding house in Millhaven and was turned away at the door. The woman who ran it looked at Rosie and then at Clara's left hand, which was bare, and said she did not take in unmarried women with children. It brought the wrong kind of attention. Clara stood on the porch of that boarding house for a moment longer than she should have, just breathing, just holding herself together in the cold afternoon air. That was when she heard the boots. Slow, even unhurried. The kind of walk that belongs to a man who has nowhere to rush to because he has already seen what rushing gets you. He was tall, not the kind of tall that tries to fill a room, but the kind that just does without thinking about it. Dark hair under a gray hat, a jaw that looked like it had been carrying things quietly for a long time, and eyes the color of still water before a storm. He stopped a few feet from her. He did not stare. He did not crowd her. He just looked at her the way a man looks when he has seen trouble enough times to recognize it, and he is trying to decide whether or not it is his business. Rosie looked up at him and said very seriously, Our house did not work. The man looked down at Rosie. Something moved across his face too quickly for Clara to read it. He said, That happens sometimes. His name was Eli Calhoun. He owned the Calhoun Ranch, for miles outside of Millhaven, one of the older spreads in the county, and he lived in it alone because his wife had died 3 years ago from a fever that moved too fast for anyone to stop, and his son, Thomas, who had been 4 years old at the time, now slept in a room within a hall and barely spoke above a whisper to anyone outside the ranch hands. Eli had come into town to pick up a part for the water pump and some flour, and to do exactly none of the things he ended up doing that day. He had not planned to stand here talking to a woman with frightened eyes and a small girl who told the truth like it was the most natural thing in the world. He said, "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" Clara straightened. She was proud, not the kind of pride that refuses help out of vanity, but the kind that has been surviving on its own for so long that asking for help feels like admitting you were wrong to try. She said, "I am still working that out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need a housekeeper, someone to cook and manage the house. I have been eating my own cooking for 2 years, and it is not going well." Clara looked at him carefully. He looked back at her. "Steady. No games in it." He said, "There's a room with a lock on the door. The boy is quiet, but he is good. You would be paid fairly, and you and your girl would have a roof until you figure the rest out." Clara said, "I do not know you." He said, "No, you do not." She waited. He said, "But I am not Harlan Briggs." She did not know how he knew that name. She found out later that the telegram from St. Louis had arrived 2 days before she did. A message warning the sheriff about a woman named Clara Weston who had left with stolen property. The sheriff, a man named Holt, had shown it to a few people, the way small-town officials sometimes do when they want something talked about. Eli had seen it at the feed store and had read it and had thought, without saying so to anyone, that the message read like something written by a man who wanted a woman afraid. He had not known he would meet her. He had not planned any of this. But here she was, and here he was, and there was a child looking up at him with her mother's same careful eyes. And Eli Calhoun had spent 3 years being a man who did not get involved in anything beyond his own fence line, and something in him was very quietly deciding that 3 years was long enough. Clara said yes. She did not have enough reasons to say no. They drove out to the ranch in a wagon with Rosie sitting between them, asking questions about the horses, and whether there were any cats, and whether the sky was always as big in Texas. Eli answered every question with the same quiet patience he gave everything. Clara watched him from the side of her vision and tried to figure out if he was real. The house was large and clean the way that a house is clean when someone is trying very hard to keep order in a life that has had too much disorder. There were curtains that had been washed but needed mending. There was a coat hanging by the door that was too small to be Eli's and too big to be Thomas's. And Clara understood, without being told, that it had belonged to someone who was no longer here. Thomas was in the barn when they arrived. He was 7 years old with his father's dark hair and the kind of serious face that appears on children who have learned to be careful with their feelings because feelings have caused them pain. He looked at Clara from the barn door. He looked at Rosie. Rosie said, "I like your barn." Thomas said nothing, but he stepped outside and held the barn door open like he was showing her something. Clara watched her daughter follow the small, quiet boy into the barn, and she felt something loosen just slightly in her chest. The first week was careful. Clara cooked and cleaned and mended and worked, and Eli stayed mostly in his lane, which was a ranch in the fields and the quiet early mornings with his coffee on the porch. And they moved around each other with a kind of respectful distance that felt like an agreement neither of them had spoken out loud. But small things happened. He noticed when she was tired and took the water buckets without making a thing of it. She noticed when he came in late and left food warming on the stove for him, not because it was her job, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. Thomas started eating breakfast with Rosie. They sat across from each other and communicated in that mysterious way children have when words are not necessary yet. And one morning Clara caught Eli standing in the kitchen doorway, watching his son eat with something that looked almost like peace on his face. He caught her looking, and she turned away. He said quietly, "He has not sat at the table like that in a long time." She did not say anything, but she understood. 2 weeks in, the trouble came. It came first in the form of a man named Dale Voss, who rode up to the ranch on a Thursday and asked to speak to Eli. He was smooth in a way that the wrong kind of men are smooth, polished on the outside, and rotten somewhere underneath it. He said he represented a land group that had been acquiring property in the county, and that the Calhoun Ranch was a parcel they were very interested in. Eli told him the ranch was not for sale. Dale Voss smiled and said that things had a way of changing and that he would be back. He did come back. But first something worse happened. A letter arrived, not for Eli, for Clara. The sheriff brought it himself, which already said something. He stood at the door with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was either embarrassment or something hiding behind embarrassment. And he said there had been a formal complaint filed through a St. Louis court, and that a woman named Clara Wesson was required to appear and answer charges of theft. Clara looked at the letter, and her hands were completely steady. She said, "There's no stolen property." Sheriff Holt said, "Ma'am, I know how these things can go, but if the papers are filed right, I have to take some action." Eli was standing behind her. She had not heard him come in, but he was there, and his voice when he spoke was calm the way that deep water is calm. He said, "On what grounds, Holt?" The sheriff looked at him. Eli said, "She has been employed here for 2 weeks. She has not left the property. Whatever was allegedly stolen, she does not have it. If someone wants to press that matter, they can speak to my lawyer in Abilene." The sheriff said, "It is not that simple, Eli." Eli said, "Make it simple." That night after Rosie and Thomas were in bed, Clara came out onto the porch where Eli was standing in the dark, and she said, "I do not want to bring my trouble into your house." He filed legal papers. He called his lawyer. He sent a letter to a contact in the land records office who confirmed that 3 ranches that sold to Voss's group had done so under documented financial pressure and threats. He built a case the way he built everything, quietly, steadily, brick by brick. But the night before the court date, when Eli came in from the barn and found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with Rosie asleep in her lap and a piece of paper in her hand that said if she did not withdraw from the marriage and leave the county within 48 hours, something would happen to her daughter, that was the night Eli stopped being quiet. He sat across from her, and he looked at her face and the paper, and he said, "I need you to listen to me." She was listening. He said, "I know you've been through things that made you feel like you were on your own in all of it, like protecting yourself and her was something you had to do alone because there was no one in your corner. I know what that feels like. I have lived a version of it." She looked up at him. He said, "You are not alone in this anymore. I need you to believe that, not because of the papers we signed, because it is true." Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I believe you," and something in her face changed. Something that had been braced against the world for so long finally, gently let go. The case was settled in 3 weeks. The lawyer in Abilene was thorough, and the judge was honest, and the complaint Briggs had filed fell apart under proper scrutiny when a woman in St. Louis came forward to say she had seen Clara leave with only what was hers. Voss's land group came under investigation for the pressure campaign against Calhoun and 2 other ranches. The fire was traced back and charges were filed. Neither Briggs nor Voss came anywhere near Millhaven after that. The morning after the final letter arrived from the lawyer confirming that everything was settled, Clara found Eli on the porch with his coffee, and she stood beside him and watched the sun come up over his land, and she thought, "This is the first morning in 5 years I have not woken up afraid." She told him that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to find a reason to ask you something for a while now." She waited. He said, "The arrangement we made was a practical thing. You know that, and I have kept to what I said." She said, "You have?" He said, "But I would like it to be something else now, if you want that too, not for protection, not because the papers already say it, because I would like you to be here, the real way, the way I think about you, and about Rosie." She looked at him. He was not a man who said many things, but everything he said, he meant. She took the coffee cup from his hand, and she held his hand instead, and she said, "I am already here. I have been here for a while." He closed his hand around hers. Inside the house, they heard Rosie's voice asking Thomas what was for breakfast, and Thomas's slightly more uncertain voice asking if she thought his father knew how to make flapjacks, and then Rosie's very confident answer that her mama could make flapjacks and that they could just ask her. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. Thomas said, with the smallest, most careful voice, "You think she would mind if I asked her to?" And Rosie said she would not mind. She likes it when people ask. There was a pause. Then Thomas said, a little louder, "Could you maybe teach me to ask her?" Eli heard it from the porch. Clara heard it too. She was already moving toward the door. And when she came inside and found Thomas standing there with his serious small face and his hands clasped in front of him like he was about to say something very important, she crouched down in front of him and she waited. He said, "Would it be all right if I called you something other than ma'am?" She said, "What would you like to call me?" He thought about it very carefully. He said, "The other boys at school call theirs Mama." Clara's eyes went warm and full, and she said, "Then that is exactly what you should call me." He nodded once, like a decision had been made and filed properly. Then he said, "Mama, do you know how to make flapjacks?" She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere deep when the heart finally has room to breathe. She said, "I do. Come help me." And Thomas Calhoun took her hand and walked her into the kitchen like she had always been there, like she had always been his, like the most natural thing in the world was simply this: a family finding its way back together from pieces that were never supposed to fit, and somehow fitting perfectly anyway. Eli stood in the doorway and watched his son laugh for the first time in longer than he could measure, and he thought about the October morning when a woman with a leather bag and a brave little girl had stood on a porch that was not hers, holding herself together in the cold air, and he thought about how the most important things in life do not arrive the way you plan them. They arrive the way they need to, and you either let them in or you do not. He was glad beyond words that he had let her in. That evening, the four of them sat at the table, and the food was warm and the lantern was soft, and Rosie talked about the cats in the barn, and Thomas corrected her count very seriously, and Eli caught Clara's eyes across the table, and she smiled, really smiled, the kind that reaches all the way up, and for the first time in 3 years, the Calhoun house did not feel like a place where something was missing. It felt like home. If this story moved you, if it stayed with you even a little, I would love for you to leave a comment and tell me what part touched you most. And tell me where you are watching from. There are people watching this from all over the world, and every name and every place matters. If you're not subscribed yet, please do. There are so many more stories here. Stories about healing and belonging and quiet love that holds on even when everything else lets go. You deserve every single one of them.